Hi, everyone. My name is David White. I have this fancy title at the University of California, Santa Barbara, that you can see on the screen here, where I teach, but it's not entirely fanciful because since I finished my last book on yoga 4 years ago, I've been writing about comparative religion and comparative mythology, especially. So that's my title is Professor of Comparative Religion. When Jacob first contacted me about doing this conference, I said no at the beginning because I'd already written 4 books on the history of yoga from its origins down to the present time, and I'd kind of OD'd on the subject. But then when Jacob said I could talk about my current research, I agreed because I've nearly finished a book that I'm really excited about, and as it turns out, it does relate to yoga, albeit in an indirect way. My title is related to yoga because one of the many ways in which the yogic body has been described, beyond the stuff you all know about the chakras and the kundalini, has been as a pool of solar fire and a well of lunar nectar. And another way that's been used to talk about it has been as 2 pots or 2 reaction vessels in an alchemical laboratory. Here, the upper chamber is the head, and the lower chamber is the torso. In India's Middle Ages, the people who riffed on this image more than anyone else were members of an ascetic order called the Nath Yogis, N-A-T-H Yogis. You see that on the screen, whose legendary founder was named Gorakhnath, and he's a yogi who probably lived in the 12th century in northwestern India. Gorakhnath is credited with being the author of several Sanskrit language works on Hatha Yoga, and he also left behind an extensive collection of poems in a vernacular language on the topic of the yogic body and the experience of the yogi. Finally, he and his disciples are the subject of a rich body of legend whose symbolism is both yogic and alchemical. Gorakh had many disciples, one of whom was named Guga. And there's a story about Guga meeting 2 outcast women and then asking them for water from their water pots. One of them protests, and she says that she can't give him water because her body, which she herself calls a clay pot, is impure. So Guga then shoots an arrow, and it bursts both of her pots at the same time. And she answers with the words, "Look at the state of my body. You have broken my 2 pots." So clearly she's referring to her body as a set of 2 pots. Top pot is your head, lower pot is your abdomen. And these upper and lower have several correlates which remain constant across several medieval Indian systems of knowledge. So it's important that you bear these correlations in mind as I move through my discussion of these systems. The bicameral structure I'm going to focus on the most today is one found in Hindu alchemy, a highly sophisticated system of practical knowledge that had its heyday in India between the 10th and 15th centuries, when about 100 works were written on the subject. A dozen of these are original and important. The rest are generally derivative of these 12. The Alchemical Body, which you see in the center of the screen here, is the title of the first book that I wrote on the history of yoga. And my argument in that book was that the yogic body was a replica of the Hindu alchemist's reaction vessel, a 2-chambered apparatus with a fire burning below and a cooling chamber on top. On this image, and the nearly identical one I'm going to show you in a moment, you'll see a pool of fire, actually a hot sulfur spring at the bottom, and the moon at the top. The pool of fire, which doubles as the burning sun in the yogic body, corresponds to the fire beneath an alchemical reaction vessel. The moon at the top is an upside-down well of nectar, and that's explained in one of Gorakhnath's poems, where he says, "In the vault of heaven is an inverted well, that is the place of nectar. He who has a guru drinks his fill. He who has no guru goes thirsty." So the vault of heaven is the yogi's cranial vault, and the nectar that Gorakhnath is referring to is the yogi's semen that's been raised up from the pool of fire in his lower abdomen to be transmuted into the nectar of immortality through the thermodynamics of yoga. So you want to keep in mind these sets of polarities. On the one hand, you have the lower abdomen and the cranial vault. On the other, the upper chamber and lower chamber of a reaction vessel. You have the moon and the sun. You have a well of nectar and a pool of fire. You have male, which corresponds to the semen in the yogi's head, and female, which corresponds to uterine blood, menstrual blood in the yogi's lower abdomen. And then further on, you have mercury, which is the mineral form of semen, and sulfur, which is the mineral form of menstrual blood or uterine blood. What you see here on this slide is a miniature painting from Rajasthan in Western India from the 19th century, depicting the moon as the source of rain. So you see the moon god holding all these pots that are filled with water, and you can see rain falling down from the moon above his head onto his head. And the idea here is a cosmological one from Indian cosmology that maintains that all the moisture in the world falls down from the moon in the form of rain, and all the enlivening fluids in the universe ultimately come from the moon, including semen, which is in this respect considered to be lunar in these systems. The opposite is the sun, which drinks up, dries up, evaporates all those fluids, and it is linked to uterine blood, the female fiery fluid that dries up men's semen, according to Indian understandings of sexual intercourse. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to that slide I showed you a moment ago, but with a slightly different image at the center of it, to once again remind you about the way that bipolarity operates. You see that same slide a second time, but this time with a reaction vessel between the moon and the pool of sulfur, but with the same polarities operative. Lower abdomen and cranial vault corresponds to the pool of fire below and the well of nectar above, the two chambers of the apparatus, sun and moon, female and male, menstrual blood and semen, sulfur and mercury. Now, this lunar vault of heaven is at once the cooled inner surface of the upper chamber of the reaction vessel. It's also the inner surface of your skull, of your cranial vault. In both cases, the same dynamic is operative. In the alchemical case, mercury is cooked slowly in the lower chamber of the reaction vessel, along with the minerals in which it's embedded, including sulfur. It evaporates up to the top of the reaction vessel, which has a cooling chamber above it, and that vessel, which corresponds to the head, has beads of condensed pure quicksilver that form on its surface, and that's the pure mercury that's evaporated out of the sulfur in the lower vessel. That is the quicksilver that the alchemist can then further treat and eventually ingest it. And actually, he doesn't just drink mercury like out of a thermometer. He makes it into a little pill, and that's what you see here, a solid pill of mercury. And ideally, if you ingest this, or at least slip it into your soft palate inside of your mouth, it will transform you into a superhuman alchemist. Now, that plays out in the same way in yoga, because the semen that is raised up from the heat in the lower abdomen, in that fiery pool of solar pool of female menstrual blood that is said to coexist in the male yogic body, it rises up along the spinal column and it condenses in the cranial vault in the form of nectar. The semen has been transformed through the thermodynamics of yoga. Now, what does this have to do with mercury and sulfur? I've already started to say that mercury is the mineral form of semen and sulfur the mineral form of menstrual blood in the alchemist's world. And they are, in fact, the semen of the Hindu god Shiva and the menstrual blood of the Hindu goddess Shakti. And it is their sexual fluids, in fact, that are being shared and used in the alchemist's practice. Why are there these homologies between semen and mercury and menstrual blood and sulfur? Well, in Hindu Tantra, the entire universe is created and sustained through a cosmic intercourse between the god Shiva and the goddess by her many names, Shakti, Devi, Durga, Parvati, and so forth. And what happens in the Tantric age, if you look at the image on the right of the screen, from about the 8th century forward, images of Shiva, which are always a lingam, an erect phallus, come back here. In the Tantric age, that phallus is embedded in a yoni, which is a representation of the goddess's vulva. So the lingam yoni on the right is basically an image of Shiva and the goddess going at it, having sex eternally. And so, in fact, what the alchemist was doing in his laboratory was mixing divine semen and uterine blood or menstrual blood. And you have to remember that Hindu alchemy is a form of tantric practice, and much of Hindu tantra, including tantric yoga, involved transactions in sexual fluids. So the goddess and Shiva maintain the universe through their constant sexual intercourse, but in fact, Shiva never has an orgasm. He is able to withhold his semen, and that's the way by which he retains his great power of creation and procreation by never letting it go. So in that respect, he's better than Sting. He never gives it up. But there's a story about how Mercury came into existence, because after all, it is Shiva's semen. And the first part of this story is familiar to all Hindus. It is the story about a demon who has gained power over the universe through a boon, a power of invulnerability, but it has one loophole, and that is that he can only be killed, he can only be defeated by a son of Shiva. Well, the demon thinks he has it made because Shiva's never had a son, and he's never going to have a son because Shiva never comes. So the gods send Agni, the god of fire, to Shiva, where he's living on top of his mountain, Mount Kailash, at the top of the universe. And he's going at it with the goddess, as he is at all times. And Agni comes to the window of Shiva's little cave, and in the form of a pigeon, actually, Agni taps on the window of that little cave there, and Shiva turns away from what he's been doing forever, and he ejaculates. And this is the first and only time Shiva ever comes. Shiva's semen falls into the beak of Agni, because Agni's taken the form of a pigeon, and Agni goes flying across the universe. And as he flies across the universe, 5 drops of that semen fall to the ground. Now that's the alchemical spin on the myth. The myth that all Hindus know ends with Agni spitting all of the semen that was in his beak, because it was too hot for him to hold, even though he is fire itself. And he spits it into the Ganges River. And in the Ganges, the semen of Shiva sort of coagulates, and suddenly a little boy emerges out of that water of the river. And that little boy is Shiva's son, Skanda, who will eventually defeat that demon who thought he had it made. There's one added little anecdote to the story, because Skanda is unusual in ways that I'll describe. As soon as he manifests in the waters of the Ganges, 6 heavenly maidens come to him, their breasts flowing with milk, because they want to breastfeed this adorable divine child. And Skanda, he's only like a few minutes old. He looks around and he does what any man would do. He grows 6 heads so he can suck at all those breasts at the same time. And that's the end of the story. But for the alchemical purpose, it's those 5 drops of semen that fell into the ground that are the source of mercury, because each of those drops burrows down into the ground to form a well of mercury. Remember the title of my talk here. It's Wells of Nectar. And you're going to hear a lot about wells for the next hour or so.